So, you did something very unique that most producers don't do. You took a flat rate to work with the band instead of taking the typical royalty thing, even though you may have made more money with that. What was your reasoning behind that?
I genuinely don't feel like I'm being an overly generous person in this regard. I just feel like if you see a room full of people and they're all behaving horribly, and you just carry on your normal life not behaving horribly, that doesn't make you noble. That doesn't mean that you're an extra special person. It just means that there was all of this awful shit going on and you didn't participate in it.
Interesting way of looking at things, yeah. So, speaking of some of the bad stuff that happened, interestingly, that letter you sent to Nirvana, you specifically stated, potential problems that may run into with the label. When those exact problems you foretold actually did happen, I'm assuming you weren't surprised. So how did you take it?
Like you said, I wasn't surprised. There was an active attempt to wreck my career on the part of the people associated with that record label. And, clearly it didn't work. Like, I'm still here making records every day and they're all selling insurance or timeshares or something,
Yeah.
So I don't feel bad about the way things turned out, but that was a rough year.
I'm really sorry you had to go through that. When did you first realize that this was happening, that this was starting to develop these problems?
Well, the first inkling was when the band called me and said, yeah, the record label and the management hate the record. They want us to redo it all. And I was like, yeah, I kind of saw that one coming. The record label stamping their feet about it and trying to get them to change it, them ultimately making some changes, the record coming out in a way that was less than satisfying for me, given that their record label and their management tried to scapegoat me like pretty aggressively prior to the release. Like, all of that whole trajectory, I think that was kind of preordained. I don't think there's any way they could have gotten out of that record without something like that happening. Whoever their engineer was, something on that spectrum was going to happen. Some combination of those events was going to happen. I might have been, I was more of a prick then. I was more like willing to irritate people. And so I think I was probably a little coarser about my reaction to all of those things than was necessary. And I'd like to think that I wouldn't behave that way now. It was a very dark time for me. The year after I did that record, I went completely broke the year after making that record. There was an aggressive campaign on the part of Geffen Records to discredit me or embarrass me or try to cause me harm, which was effective in that I lost a lot of business in the intervening year or so. But I don't personalize that toward the band. I feel like the band were the one party in all of this who were not taking shots at me,
Yeah.
They were very circumspect when they were talking about the process of making the record in interviews and stuff. Like, they didn't want to ruffle any feathers. And so they didn't personalize their complaints very much. And I'm gratified by the fact that they didn't scapegoat me to the extent, that their record label and their management did. It was a surreal experience to have this big corporation have invested a lot of money and publicity capital in a record by the biggest band in the world and have those very selfsame people shit talking me to music journalists and other people in the music business and actively trying to cause me harm. That was a very surreal experience for them to be shitting on this record that was obviously very important to them. From a business standpoint, it was going to be a huge record. And I just didn't get why they were shitting on the record. And then as a secondary effect, shitting on me. I just didn't get it. And it was an unpleasant period for me. The year after making that record, I saw a big drop off in my normal clientele, like the smaller bands that I was working with, the independent bands. A lot of them were suspicious of me now because I'd worked on this big hit record, and that made them suspicious of me and my motive. There was a kind of a normal career trajectory where somebody would start out in the underground and they would start to get noticed, and then they would become sort of a mainstream player and then unavailable to anybody who wasn't a big name.
Yeah.
Something similar to that had happened with Butch Vig, like who was a hero in the underground, in the punk scene. Then his name was associated with Nirvana, and suddenly none of the bands that were his bread and butter in the years prior, none of them could get him to answer a phone call. And that's just a result of him moving into a sort of a professional tier where those bands didn't have access, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a suspicion of me that was sort of expected to happen with me, that I would now be unavailable to all of my normal clientele. So that normal clientele disappeared or dropped off dramatically. And then the sort of mainstream or major label artists were being actively discouraged from working with me. And I know this because I have friends who were in the process of making records in the year or two after that, who were told explicitly by their handlers that they were not allowed to work with me. They could work with basically anybody else. They just weren't allowed to work with me.
That's crazy that this happened to you, man. I'm really sorry.
It was a boys' club. It was a closed circle in the mainstream music business, and I represented a way of working that would negate that network. And so I'm not surprised at all that people were discouraged from working with me.
But I can imagine that there must have been other individuals who were also very much in line with the punk ethos. Why were they so intimidated by you in particular?
I don't know that people were intimidated by me. I think that people saw me as a liability. Like if you're involved with a big record label and your relationship with them is somewhat fragile, meaning that they could wreck you, they could ruin your career, you would not want to antagonize those people by working with someone that they saw as an obstacle, or that they saw as someone that they saw as an impediment to them going through their normal modes of behavior. And then if you were a small band and you aspired to being picked up by one of these big record labels, and it was made clear to you that I was a pariah in that world, you also wouldn't want to associate yourself with me, because you wouldn't want to be tarred with this brush of, they're a defiant indie band, and they would close some doors on themselves if they did that. So I basically had to rebuild my clientele from the deep underground network, from the peer group of people who were not part of that aspirational world. And I had, existing clients, people that I had worked with for years that stuck with me, but I had to rebuild my new clientele from the ground up, basically.
Jeez.
I'll never forget the moment. There was a moment, maybe 6 months or so after the release of that record, where I did the books on the studio, and I paid all the utilities, and I paid the salaries for the other employees, and I paid the insurance, and I paid everything, and I had 50 cents in the bank. Like my bank balance after paying all my bills and doing payroll and the mortgage and everything, my bank balance was 50 cents. And that was, unusual for me at the time, because I had been working very steadily and I had built up a bit of a cushion, which allowed me to survive that fallow period. The band made the record on their own terms. They, instead of going into the studio with the blessing of their record label, they went outside the record label system and made a record on their own, and then brought it back to the label and said, "This is our record. Please put it out." that behavior, that act, represented a threat to the paradigm of the record label, where the record label is in charge and responsible for significant decisions about a band's career, right?
Yeah.
So they had an incentive to see that that method failed and that the band wasn't allowed to proceed with putting a record out that they had made on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
So they were incentivized to try to get the band to scrap the record and do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to the band's credit, it's to Nirvana's credit, that they said, no, this is the way we did it, and that we like this record and we want to put it out. In the end, there were a few songs that were remixed. I genuinely believe that that was because the band found fault with those original mixes. I don't believe that it was done as a concession to the record label, although it could be viewed that way, and it could be a coincidence that the singles were the songs that were ended up being reworked. But I genuinely believe that the band had reservations and they wanted to rework those songs. So they did. And in the end, the album that made its way into the stores, the album that you could go buy, was precisely exactly the album that the band wanted you to hear. There's no way to work the math where I didn't cost myself $1 million or so by not taking a royalty on that record. But the point of it is that the way producers and such are compensated, or at the time were compensated, was by a subtractive royalty, meaning that if the band were due a royalty of X percentage points of the income of the record, as a nominal figure, let's say the band was getting 12 points or 12% of the income of the record. Mm-hmm. And the producer was being paid a couple of those points, then the producer's royalty would literally be subtracted from the band's income. Like if the band was due, $120,000 and the producer was getting 2 points, the producer would get $2,000.
Yeah.
And you can see very easily there how, given the other expenses that the band has to carry, how it would almost always work out that the producer would be being paid more than the band members.
Really?
And that was by design. That's the way the industry was structured, so that industry players would be overcompensated and that musicians would be undercompensated, and band members and songwriters would be undercompensated. And I just didn't want to participate in that system. I thought that system was corrupt and unethical, and I did not want to be, in the same way that I did not want to be one of the people leeching off of Nirvana's success and popularity on a personal level. I didn't want to be a drag on their income. I didn't want to be a drain on the hard-won compensation that they were going to be getting. Like, they did the hard part of writing all this music and touring the world and becoming popular and famous. And then they did the hard part in the studio of executing it all. And then they were going to have to do the hard part of carrying that record around with them for the rest of their lives as part of their legacy. And I just didn't see, and I still don't see it as ethical for me to insist on being paid forever for a couple of weeks' work. It just seems unconscionable to me. So I just refuse to participate in that kind of arrangement. And also, I like doing my job. I like making records for people. And so that means as long as I can keep getting work, as long as I keep making records for people, I should have a steady income. And I shouldn't make it other people's responsibility to pay me for having done a job a while ago. It just seems like that just seems reasonable. All of these positions seem like normal thought processes to me. It doesn't seem strange or unusual. It's only in the perverse context of the norms of the music business where that could be seen as unusual thinking. All that you can ask from an artist is for them to have a vision, to see their vision through to satisfactory completion, and then present it to you in a manner that they are comfortable with. Mm-hmm. Nirvana said, yeah, this is our album. It's finished. This is what we want you to buy. And that was it. It's their record. They're allowed to make those decisions. And the fact that it might bruise my feelings slightly, that, something that I worked on got reworked slightly.